It was a slow Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. I had taken a half-day off work, nothing out of the ordinary, just a routine follow-up with my urologist, Dr. Morgan. A quick in and out, I thought, before heading home to surprise Carol with takeout from her favorite deli. She loved their pastrami sandwiches, and I figured we could sit on the patio, enjoy the spring weather, and maybe reconnect a little. I wasn't prepared for what I saw in the parking lot of Dr. Morgan's clinic. I had just parked my car when a sleek black Audi pulled into the reserved space closest to the building. The door swung open, and a woman stepped out, her long auburn hair catching the sunlight. She moved quickly, confidently, like someone who knew where they were going and didn't care if they were seen. I recognized her immediately. It was Carol. My wife. She hadn't mentioned an appointment, but maybe she was there for me. Maybe it was a surprise. The thought gave me a warm flicker of hope that felt almost foolish as it crossed my mind. She was always full of little surprises, after all. But then, the passenger door opened, and out stepped Dr. Morgan. Not in his usual white coat and scrubs, but in jeans and a leather jacket. He said something to her, and she laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from her in months. He reached over to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and she leaned into it, her hand brushing his arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. My first thought was denial. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe I was imagining things. But it was her. I knew that walk, the way she tilted her head when she laughed. My Carol. I stayed in my car, heart pounding, as they entered the clinic together. The door closed behind them, and I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I had just seen. Was it innocent? Could it be explained? Or had I just stumbled upon something I was never supposed to see? A million questions raced through my mind, but one thing was clear: whatever this was, it wasn't normal. And I wasn't leaving until I had some answers. I went to my appointment with Dr. Morgan that afternoon, trying to suppress the storm building in my head. Carol and he had disappeared into the building minutes before. My first instinct was to storm in, demand answers, and drag the truth out of both of them. But I stopped myself. What if I was wrong? What if it was all some strange misunderstanding? I wasn't ready to be the fool who accused his wife and doctor without proof. I sat in the waiting room, staring at the sterile walls and thumbing through an old magazine I wasn't reading. Every sound in the clinic felt louder, sharper, heels clicking on tile, muffled conversations behind doors, the faint hum of machinery. I kept thinking about how she looked at him, that easy smile she hadn't given me in months. When the nurse finally called my name, I followed her down the corridor with my pulse pounding in my ears. I was led into an exam room and told to wait. I sat on the cold vinyl chair, bouncing my leg nervously. The longer I waited, the worse my thoughts became. When Dr. Morgan finally walked in, his expression was as composed and professional as ever. He greeted me warmly, asked how I was doing, and started flipping through my file. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. That only made me angrier. "Any discomfort since your last checkup?" he asked, not looking up. I clenched my fists, tempted to confront him right there, but I kept it together. "No, just here for the follow-up," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, stepping over to the sink to wash his hands. "Good to hear. Let's take a look." I stood up, unbuckling my belt as he turned back. I hated this part of the visit even before today. Having another man handling you in such an intimate and clinical way was never comfortable. But now, with what I'd just seen, the whole thing felt humiliating on a level I couldn't even describe. As he examined me, I couldn't stop thinking about his hands. Those hands, his touch clinical and impersonal now, had maybe been on my wife. The thought made my stomach turn. I wanted to shove him away, yell at him, but instead, I stayed frozen, seething internally. "You're healing well," he said after a minute, his tone detached. "No signs of lingering issues. I'll want to see you again in 6 months to make sure everything stays clear." I nodded, barely processing his words. I just wanted it to be over, to get out of there before I said or did something I couldn't take back. Dr. Morgan leaned back against the counter, writing notes in my file. "Anything else on your mind, Kenneth?" Any concerns? I stared at him, searching for something in his expression, a crack in his facade, a clue that he knew what I had seen earlier. But there was nothing. He was calm, collected, completely unfazed. No, I said finally, my voice tight. Everything's fine. He nodded again, closing the file and handing me a paper with some standard post-appointment instructions. Great. If anything comes up, don't hesitate to call. I walked out of that clinic feeling more humiliated than I ever had in my life. I didn't have concrete proof of anything, but every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. And the worst part was that Dr. Morgan wasn't just a random fling or a faceless stranger. He was someone I had trusted, someone who knew details about my health and my life. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a long time, staring at the house. Carol was inside, probably cooking dinner or working on one of her projects. I couldn't bring myself to go in right away. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like an outsider in my own life. Whatever was happening between Carol and Dr. Morgan, it wasn't something I could ignore. I needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it was. But for now, I just sat there, trying to figure out how to face her without breaking apart. The drive home was a blur. My hands stayed tight on the wheel, my mind replaying the scene in the clinic parking lot over and over again. Carol and Dr. Morgan, walking side by side, laughing like they shared a private world that I wasn't a part of. My first instinct had been to confront her immediately, to storm into the house and demand the truth. But as I pulled into our driveway, I knew that approach wouldn't get me anywhere. Carol was smart. If I accused her outright, she'd deflect, twist the conversation, maybe even get angry at me for doubting her. No, I needed to play it differently. Let her talk herself into a corner. People reveal the most when they think they're in control of the situation. I walked inside, keeping my expression neutral. The smell of garlic and onions greeted me as I entered the kitchen. Carol was at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. She looked up with a quick smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, you're home early," she said, turning back to the pot. "Yeah," I replied, setting my keys down on the counter. "Thought I'd beat the traffic. How's your day been?" "Busy," she said, her tone breezy. "Had a few deadlines to meet." "You?" "Not bad. Appointment went fine. Dr. Morgan says everything looks good." She nodded, her back to me as she sprinkled herbs into the sauce. "That's great. You must be relieved." I watched her closely, waiting for the right moment. "Funny thing happened on my way into the clinic," I said, keeping my tone light. "I thought I saw someone who looked a lot like you in the parking lot." She was with Dr. Morgan, of all people. Carol froze for a split second, a pause so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Then she turned around, her expression carefully composed. "Really? That's such a weird coincidence," she said, laughing softly. "What are the chances of that?" I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Yeah, strange, right? I mean, she even had the same scarf as you. The red one you wore last week." Carol's eyes flickered for a moment, and she forced another laugh. "Well, it wasn't me, obviously. I've been here all day. Maybe she's my doppelganger." The casual tone, the forced humor, it was all an act, and I knew it. She was lying to my face without hesitation, and that realization hit me harder than I expected. There had always been an unspoken trust between us, a foundation I thought was unshakable. Seeing her so blatantly fabricate a story made something inside me snap. "Crazy coincidence," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You don't run into your doppelganger every day, especially not with my doctor." Carol smiled, but it was strained now, the cracks in her facade starting to show. "Yeah, life's full of surprises." I didn't push further. "Not yet." She thought she'd covered her tracks, that I'd bought her story, and that gave me the advantage. Let her think she was in the clear. Let her guard down. The truth would come out eventually, and when it did, I wanted to have all the evidence I needed. Dinner that night was tense, though we pretended otherwise. We talked about the kids, about Emma's upcoming science fair and Jason's soccer practice. But underneath the small talk, there was a current of unease. I knew she felt it too, though she hid it well. After the kids went to bed, I stayed in the living room, pretending to watch TV while Carol worked in her studio. I could hear the faint hum of her tablet and the occasional click of her mouse. Everything seemed so normal, but it wasn't. I thought about her reaction earlier, the quick shift in her tone, the way she avoided looking directly at me when she laughed. She was lying, and now I had to figure out why. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling while Carol's breathing evened out beside me. I wanted to shake her awake, demand she tell me the truth, but I didn't. Instead, I planned my next move. If she thought I'd let this go, she didn't know me as well as she thought. The next morning, Carol acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek as she grabbed her keys, saying she'd be working from the cafe downtown to get a fresh perspective. I watched her leave, sipping my coffee slowly as my mind churned. If she thought her flimsy lie about a doppelganger had worked, she was underestimating me. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Once the house was quiet, I went to her studio. It wasn't snooping, I told myself it was gathering evidence. Carol's workspace was always meticulously organized, her laptop, a notepad, and a pencil arranged in a way that screamed control. Her calendar hung on the wall, color-coded with deadlines and client meetings. I didn't expect to find much, but it didn't hurt to look. Her laptop was password-protected, and her phone, which she never left behind, was gone. That left the notepad. Flipping through the pages, I found sketches and notes for her projects, reminders about grocery shopping, and a list of places she wanted to take the kids during summer break. Normal stuff. But then, tucked between pages, I found a receipt. It was from a boutique hotel about 20 minutes away. The date was 2 weeks ago, and the room number was scrawled in pen at the top. Carol never mentioned staying at a hotel, and as far as I knew, there hadn't been any reason for her to. I stared at the receipt, anger building in my chest. This wasn't something I could brush off. If I wanted answers, I needed to go deeper. I decided to check her email. Carol had a habit of leaving her accounts logged in on the family desktop. Sure enough, her browser was open, and her work email account was still signed in. I scrolled through the inbox, scanning for anything suspicious. Most of it was routine, client updates, payment confirmations, and project briefs. But then I saw an email from a personal Gmail account, signed only with M. The subject line read, "Had a great time." I clicked it, and my stomach churned as I read the message. Last week was amazing. It felt so good to finally spend time together without any distractions. I can't wait until the next time we can sneak away. Let me know when you're free again. M. The timestamp on the email matched the date on the hotel receipt. I leaned back in the chair, my mind racing. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. Carol wasn't just lying to me, she was cheating. But who was M? The answer hit me almost immediately. Dr. Morgan. It made sense, didn't it? The way he'd looked so composed during my appointment, like nothing was out of the ordinary. The casual way Carol had brushed off my comment about seeing her with him. I felt a wave of rage rising in me, but I forced it down. Confronting her now wouldn't give me what I wanted. I needed to be smart about this. I took a picture of the receipt and the email with my phone, saving them for later. Then I cleared the browser history and put everything back the way I found it. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, tidying up the house, taking the kids to soccer practice, but my thoughts kept circling back to Carol. When she came home that evening, I watched her carefully. She was cheerful, smiling as she talked about her productive day at the cafe. I nodded along, playing my role, but inside, I was seething. The next step was obvious, I had to confirm it for myself. The following week, I decided to take action. Carol's routine was predictable, which made it easy to track her movements. On Thursday, she mentioned another working session at the cafe. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. Sure enough, she didn't go to the cafe. Instead, she drove to the same boutique hotel listed on the receipt. I parked a safe distance away, watching as she entered the building. My heart was pounding, but I stayed calm. I waited for about 15 minutes before stepping out of the car and heading inside. The receptionist glanced up as I approached the desk. "Hi, I'm supposed to meet someone in room 204, I said, keeping my tone casual. "I forgot my phone in the car, could you remind me of the name the room's under?" The receptionist hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. "That's under Morgan." That was all the confirmation I needed. I walked out of the hotel, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. That evening, I sat across from Carol at the dinner table, watching her laugh with the kids like nothing was wrong. I couldn't believe how easily she compartmentalized everything, how effortlessly she switched between roles. After the kids went to bed, I poured myself a drink and joined her in the living room. "How was the cafe?" I asked casually, swirling the whiskey in my glass. "Good," she said without missing a beat. "Got a lot done." I nodded slowly, taking a sip of my drink. "You know, I was thinking about that weird coincidence we talked about last week. The one with the woman who looked like you at the clinic." Carol glanced at me, her smile faltering for a split second. "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah," I said, leaning back on the couch. "It's funny, isn't it? How people can look so similar. Almost makes you wonder if they're hiding something." She didn't respond right away, her expression carefully neutral. "I guess so." I smiled, but it wasn't a warm one. "Yeah. Makes you wonder." Carol shifted uncomfortably, then stood up. "I'm going to bed. You coming?" "In a bit," I said, watching her retreat down the hallway. I didn't follow. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. But soon. Very soon. When I finally confronted Carol, I thought I was prepared for anything. Tears, anger, denials, maybe even the kind of hollow excuses you hear in movies. What I didn't expect was for her to lay the blame squarely on me and my medical issues. That, of all things, hit harder than any shouting match ever could. The night started with me knocking on the bedroom door. Carol had locked herself inside after dinner, and I knew she was trying to avoid facing the reality I'd exposed in front of our friends and her sister. The humiliation had already done some of the work, but this conversation was one I needed to have alone. After a moment of silence, I heard her voice, hoarse from crying. "What do you want, Kenneth?" "We need to talk," I said, my tone steady. There was no response at first, and I almost thought she wouldn't let me in. Then I heard the click of the lock, and I pushed the door open to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face streaked with tears. She looked up at me, and for a moment, there was something almost like fear in her eyes. I closed the door behind me and stood by the wall, keeping my distance. "Why, Carol?" I asked bluntly. "Why him? Why this? After everything we've been through, everything we've built together?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, twisting the hem of her sweater as she struggled to find the words. Finally, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That would be a start," I said, crossing my arms. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's because of you, Kenneth. Because of your problems." I frowned, my stomach tightening. "What problems?" She gestured vaguely toward me, as if the answer was obvious. "Your problems. The reason you've been seeing Dr. Morgan. The reason we haven't been intimate." Her words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. For a moment, I couldn't even process what she was saying. When it finally clicked, anger surged through me. "You're blaming this on me?" I asked, my voice rising. "I'm not blaming you," she said quickly, her tone defensive. "I'm just trying to explain. You think it's been easy for me, Kenneth? Do you? Do you know what it's like to feel unwanted? To feel like your own husband doesn't see you as a woman anymore?" I stared at her, struggling to keep my emotions in check. So your solution was to sleep with my doctor? That's how you fix this? It wasn't like that, she snapped, standing up. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. Just did? I shot back, my voice dripping with disbelief. What does that even mean? Did you trip and fall into bed with him? She threw her hands up, pacing the room. I don't know, okay? I was worried about you, about us, and I started asking him questions about your condition. I wanted to understand what we could do, how I could help. And we connected. He understood what I was going through in a way you didn't. I took a step forward, my fists clenched. So that's your justification? You had an emotional connection, so that gave you permission to betray me? It wasn't just emotional, she admitted, her voice breaking. It was physical, too. Because I needed something I wasn't getting from you. Do you know how humiliating it was, Kenneth? To feel like I wasn't enough for my own husband? Like I was invisible? Her words hit like a sledgehammer, each one cutting deeper than the last. I'd spent months wrestling with my medical issues, feeling inadequate and broken, but I thought we were in it together. Now, she was telling me she'd used my vulnerability as an excuse to destroy everything we had. You could have talked to me, I said, my voice shaking. You could have told me how you felt. We could have worked on it together. But instead, you went behind my back and slept with the one person I trusted to help me. I did try to talk to you, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. But you didn't want to hear it. I shook my head, taking another step closer. That's not an excuse, Carol. You don't fix a broken marriage by tearing it apart. You don't solve a problem by making it worse. She collapsed back onto the bed, sobbing into her hands. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her crying. Finally, she looked up at me, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't want to hurt you, Kenneth. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said coldly. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt our kids. You destroyed our family. For what? A fling with a man who used my vulnerabilities to get closer to you? She flinched at my words, but I didn't let up. I want you out, I said firmly. Pack your things and leave. Go stay with your sister until we figure out the divorce. Her eyes widened in shock. Kenneth, please. No, I interrupted, my voice like steel. You made your choice, Carol. Now you have to live with it. She stared at me, her expression a mix of desperation and defeat. After a long moment, she nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping. I'll go, she said quietly. I turned and walked out of the room without another word, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding, but I knew this was the only way forward. Carol had made her choices, and now it was my turn to make mine. This wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about reclaiming my life and my dignity. She had taken enough from me. Now, I was taking it back. The morning after the confrontation, I began the process of severing ties with my wife in every way possible. She wasn't in the house, probably staying at her sister's place, and I didn't care to find out. The quiet of the home felt heavy, but it was a silence I needed to collect my thoughts. This wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about taking control of my life and ensuring that both my wife and the doctor paid for what they'd done. My first call was to the lawyer who had helped me prepare for this. I explained the situation in detail, outlining everything I had gathered, receipts, emails, photos, and the private investigator's report. The lawyer, a sharp and direct woman, went through the documents and nodded. You've got enough leverage here, she said. Ohio is a no-fault state, so adultery doesn't directly affect the settlement. But with this evidence, we can push for a favorable custody arrangement and protect your assets. That's what I want, I replied. She can't take the house, and I need primary custody of the kids. They don't deserve to be pulled into her mess. The lawyer assured me that we had a strong case and encouraged me to stay composed throughout the process. Her confidence gave me the resolve I needed to move forward. I didn't just want to finalize the divorce, I wanted to make sure my wife felt the weight of her decisions. I transferred my direct deposits into a separate account in my name, froze our joint credit cards, and ensured that all legal ownership of the house was addressed in my favor. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. The hardest part was explaining the situation to the kids. I kept it as simple as possible, telling them that their mother and I were separating and that it wasn't their fault. Their faces were a mix of confusion and sadness, but I reassured them that we would keep life as stable as possible. Divorcing my wife was only part of the plan. The doctor wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. I started by filing a formal complaint with the state medical board. The complaint outlined his unethical behavior, pursuing a personal relationship with my wife while treating me as a patient. I included all the evidence I had gathered, the receipts, the emails, the hotel logs, and the private investigator's report. The board acknowledged my complaint and opened an investigation. This was only the beginning. I contacted a local journalist known for covering community scandals and pitched her the story. I framed it as a case of professional misconduct, focusing on how a trusted doctor had exploited a vulnerable situation. At first, the journalist was hesitant, but after reviewing the evidence, she agreed to investigate further. While she worked on the article, I reached out to a few of the doctor's patients, people I remembered from the waiting room. I carefully suggested that they might want to look into his behavior. Most dismissed it, but a few were visibly concerned. 2 weeks later, the journalist published her story. It spread quickly through local news outlets, and the fallout was immediate. The doctor's clinic issued a public statement distancing themselves from him, and patients began canceling their appointments. The medical board expedited their investigation, eventually suspending his license for 6 months due to ethical violations. His reputation was in shambles. The man who had been admired as a respected professional was now a pariah in the community. The final confrontation happened by chance. I saw him at a cafe one afternoon, sitting alone and looking tense. I approached his table, and he glanced up, startled. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't think this is the place for." "Save it," I interrupted. "You destroyed my marriage and used your position to do it. Did you think I'd just let that slide?" He sighed, trying to maintain composure. "You're angry. I get it. But this isn't helping anyone." I leaned closer. "You don't get to decide what helps me. You thought you could take something from me without consequences. Now you're seeing just how wrong you were." He didn't respond. I straightened up, leaving him to stew in his discomfort, and walked away. The divorce proceedings were messy but decisive. The lawyer's strategy worked, and the court awarded me primary custody of the kids, full ownership of the house, and a favorable division of assets. My wife fought hard, but even her attorney seemed to realize she didn't have much ground to stand on. She moved into an apartment, visiting the kids every other weekend. Our interactions were brief and transactional, the remnants of a relationship that no longer existed.